John Clarence Woods, a sergeant in the U.S. Army and the executioner during the Nuremberg Trials, became known for the harshness with which he carried out his duties. More than an obligation, he seemed to take pleasure in it, displaying cruel behavior during each execution. His ironic smile gave the impression that he found excessive enjoyment in every hanging. He once declared, "Hanging Nazis is the best thing there is." To some, he was a relentless avenger. To others, a man who crossed the line between delivering justice and exercising brutality, becoming a symbol of ruthless retaliation. One of the most shocking cases was the execution of Julius Streicher, convicted of war crimes. In his final moments, he shouted for Hitler and hurled insults before being led to the gallows. The drop was insufficient to break his neck, leaving him hanging, struggling, and moaning for 15 minutes under the trap door. His slow and grotesque agony illustrated the extreme violence with which justice was applied in Nuremberg. The trapdoor of the final trial, the concluding chapter of Kaltenbrunner. In April 1945, Himmler appointed him military chief of all forces in southern Europe. Facing the imminent collapse of the regime, Kaltenbrunner reorganized his intelligence network to create a secret structure that would continue to operate after the surrender. Among his closest collaborators were Otto Sorseni, an expert in covert operations, and Wilhelm Wanek, responsible for maintaining strategic communications from Villa Carey. Unknown to many, since 1943, some of Brunner's associates, including Wilhelm Huttl and Werner Gutsch, had begun devising a diplomatic exit. The plan was to negotiate an independent peace with the Western Allies to jointly resist the Soviet Union. The proposal to establish an autonomous Austrian state, opposed to Nazism, reached Alan Dulles, director of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, through contacts in Switzerland. In the final days of the Third Reich, Altausi, a small village in the Austrian Alps, became a refuge for high-ranking Nazi officials. It was said that Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Central Security Office, was hiding in the nearby mountains. For 3 days, a team of U.S. soldiers and local agents worked tirelessly to locate him. The key clue came from Albrecht Geiswinkler, a British spy, pointing to Villa Carey, the nerve center of the Nazi stronghold. There they captured Wilhelm Wanek and other accomplices, but Brunner was not present. Altausi harbored top Nazi leaders while the team had to navigate false leads and enigmatic figures like Norman Bailey Stewart, an English spy linked to Nazism. The focus turned to Gisela von Westarp, Brunner's lover, and Dr. Rudolf Praxmer, accused of providing him direct assistance. Evidence of collaboration with the Gestapo tightened the net. On May 12, 1945, a unit composed of American soldiers, Austrian guides, and a CIC officer ascended the Tozgebirge to arrest Ernst Kaltenbrunner. After overcoming natural obstacles and reaching an apparently empty cabin, they convinced its occupants to surrender. Inside they found weapons, compromising documents, and Brunner's personal belongings, as he attempted to conceal his identity with false papers. Back in Altausi, local witnesses confirmed his identity, marking a milestone in the fall of the Nazi leadership. During interrogations in Nuremberg, Brunner claimed he had tried to limit Renntrop's negative influence, and that his knowledge of communism could make him a useful ally to the West. However, the evidence pointed to him as one of the main perpetrators of crimes committed by the SS and Gestapo. In his cell, Brunner was unrecognizable. His once authoritative face appeared worn and pale, a reflection of months of confinement. He ignored his interlocutor as if erasing everything around him from memory. He only reacted upon hearing Gisela's name, weakly asking about her and the twins, giving brief answers before returning to silence. On the day the trial began, Brunner did not take the defendant's bench. He had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage the night before. Weeks passed before he could appear before the tribunal. When he finally did, he was met with absolute disdain. No one offered him a hand. Some didn't even look at him. Even his defense attorney avoided greeting him, crossing his arms in clear disdain. During a break in the trial, Brunner tried to speak with one of the officers, but permission was denied. That same day he received a letter from Gisela, in which she asked him not to let his heart grow cold and reminded him that her love would remain eternal. However, the letter never reached Kaltenbrunner, as it was intercepted by a journalist who later made its contents public. Shortly after, Brunner suffered another cerebral hemorrhage. Although he managed to return to the trial, his fate was already sealed. Ernst Brunner, a man of imposing stature, over 6 feet tall, had been discharged from a military hospital shortly before facing the tribunal. His face bore scars, remnants of a car accident while under the influence of alcohol. He appeared before the judges to respond to accusations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. In an unexpected moment, he broke down in tears, declaring his innocence and claiming mistreatment during his detention by British forces. However, he soon adopted a combative stance. Seeking to avoid conviction, he argued that any document bearing his signature had been handled by subordinates. He also accused Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, of repeatedly forging his signature. Brunner insisted that his role as director of the Reich Security Office was mostly symbolic, and that his responsibilities focused on intelligence and espionage. According to his account, the most heinous crimes were ordered directly by his superior, Heinrich Himmler. He claimed he had no knowledge of the so-called Final Solution Plan until 1943, and that upon learning of it, he expressed his opposition to abuses against the Jewish population. However, he never produced evidence to support this version. He also denied being aware of the Commissar Order, which authorized the execution of captured Soviet officers. Additionally, he rejected having visited concentration camps, despite photographic evidence proving otherwise, including his presence at Mauthausen. During his testimony, Brunner stated that he did not wish to be compared to Reinhard Heydrich, his predecessor, and noted that his salary had been much lower. Despite his attempts to justify his actions, the evidence was overwhelming. He was linked to Operation Reinhard, responsible for the systematic extermination of Jews in Poland. When asked about deaths in Blinka, he claimed ignorance, although facts proved otherwise. On October 1, 1946, the tribunal found him guilty of the charges and sentenced him to death. In the early hours of October 16, he was brought to the gallows under the supervision of U.S. Sergeant John C. Woods. The drop was not long enough to cause immediate death, so he suffered for 11 minutes, a prolonged and brutal end. Before his execution, Kaltenbrunner spoke his final words, expressing his love for his homeland and claiming he had acted out of duty, denying involvement in the crimes. His body was cremated, and the ashes were scattered in the Isar River. Sergeant Woods defended the methods used, stating he was proud of his work. The final act of Streicher, a trial of propaganda. Julius Streicher was born on February 12, 1885, in Flyinghausen, Bavaria. Of strong build but short stature, he stood out for his physical presence and a face hardened by an unyielding expression. He founded and directed the weekly Der Stürmer, dedicated to spreading anti-Semitic messages, becoming a central figure in the Nazi propaganda machine. Although close to Adolf Hitler, he was removed from his position as Gauleiter of Franconia in February 1940. His dismissal followed an investigation led by Hermann Göring, accusing him of corruption, particularly for appropriating property confiscated from Jewish citizens. Streicher claimed his downfall resulted from criticisms he had made against Göring, which intensified internal tensions within the party hierarchy. He faced hostility from other leaders such as Rudolf Hess, Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, and even Göring himself. Taking advantage of the situation, these leaders managed to weaken his influence with Hitler and marginalize him from key circles of power. They even proposed shutting down Der Stürmer, a publication considered excessively virulent, even by Goebbels and Himmler. However, Hitler refused to ban it, allowing the newspaper to continue spreading its anti-Semitic message. After his removal, Julius Streicher retired to his estate near Nuremberg, stepping away from active politics, though he continued writing deeply hostile articles against Jews. At the end of the war, he attempted to flee, but was captured by U.S. troops on May 23, 1945, in a village near Widring in the Alps. He was later transferred to Nuremberg to face trial before the International Military Tribunal. Regarding the charge of conspiracy, no evidence was found that he had directly participated in planning the war. However, in terms of crimes against humanity, it was proven that for more than 2 decades he had actively fostered hatred against Jews through his writings, openly inciting their persecution. From 1938, he actively promoted their extermination, and during the conflict, he intensified his attacks, fully aware that mass killings were occurring. These actions were considered direct incitement to genocide, constituting a crime against humanity. On October 1, 1946, Streicher was found guilty of this 4th charge and sentenced to death, becoming the 7th to be executed. To the very last moment, he displayed a wild temperament. Minutes after the body of Freak was removed, Streicher was moved from his cell to the gym. The transfer was as dramatic as his character. He stubbornly refused to dress, forcing the guards to clothe him by force. When he was finally brought to the gym, they practically carried him while he shouted Hitler's name in fury, demonstrating a fanatical loyalty that he maintained until his final hour. Realizing he was being led directly to gallows number 1, the same where Hans Frank had been executed just minutes earlier, Streicher halted abruptly and began to resist violently. He was, without a doubt, the most defiant prisoner of the night, confronting his end with savage rage. Yet his efforts were futile against 2 burly U.S. soldiers specially chosen to handle condemned men like him. They dragged him to the trapdoor and positioned him before John C. Woods, who waited with impassive composure. When asked to state his name, Streicher stubbornly refused. Nevertheless, realizing his defiance would change nothing, he eventually complied, perhaps fully aware that his fate was irreversible. Through his screams and fierce opposition, he made clear that he had found no resignation, not even in the face of death. Slowly he climbed the 13 steps, gripping the railing. A knee ailment had forced him to use a cane in recent weeks, but out of pride or defiance, he faced the gallows unassisted. Upon reaching the top, he turned to the assembled crowd and, true to his provocative habit, delivered one last venomous speech. With a sarcastic tone, he said, "This year the Jews will celebrate the true Purim. For me, this is my Purim festival." He added, "The day will come when the Bolsheviks will hang you all." Then he cast a poisoned glance at Woods, shouting, "You will be hanged too." The executioner, impassive, placed the black hood over his shaved head, completing the ritual with his usual cold precision. Before the drop, Streicher spoke his final words, a message to his wife, Adele meine liebe Frau. Yet even at that moment, he commanded attention. At 2:14 a.m., when the trapdoor opened, a guttural sound erupted from the gallows. The onlookers froze. Some paled, believing they were witnessing something almost unreal. A reporter, unable to bear the scene, fainted. Woods, unflinching, descended into the trapdoor pit to complete the execution himself. No one saw clearly what he did, but it was known that he used his own body weight to finish the hanging. Streicher's thick, robust neck did not break with the drop, and the executioner had to force the fracture of his vertebrae. Minutes later, doctors confirmed his death, hastily declaring it instantaneous, though many doubted it. No one challenged it. The hanging of Julius Streicher was recorded as a grotesque execution, marked by mistakes and violence. His body, suspended from the rope without a broken neck, created a horrifying image. In a desperate attempt to hasten the outcome, Woods hung from the condemned man's legs. It was a dark episode reflecting the chaos of a justice fueled by rage, morbid executions, John C. Woods and the rope of Nazi destiny. With the fall of the Third Reich in May 1945, Joachim von Ribbentrop, former foreign minister, assumed a false identity and opened a wine shop in Hamburg. His new business allowed him to sustain himself for a time, but the cover did not last long. During a conversation about sparkling wines, an acquaintance recognized him and reported him. On June 14, 1945, a unit from the British Second Army, led by Lieutenant Jotta Goffinet, arrested him at his home. At the time of his capture, he carried 3 letters addressed to Winston Churchill, Anthony Eden, and Bernard Montgomery, intending to offer his cooperation in future trials. Ribbentrop was charged with conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He claimed he had acted solely as an executor of orders from the Chancellery and performed diplomatic functions. However, the judges rejected his defense. On October 1, 1946, the tribunal found him guilty and sentenced him to death for his direct involvement in the Nazi regime apparatus. At 1:11 a.m., 3 knocks echoed on the metal door of the gym. The sentinel turned the key, allowing Colonel Little to enter, followed by an officer and 2 soldiers escorting Ribbentrop. His face was pale, his clothes soaked. He looked more like a ghost than a man, having walked the 50 meters from his cell to the gym under bone-chilling cold. It was not an easy path for a man approaching death. Once there, his handcuffs were removed, and almost ironically, an officer asked his name as if he could deny his identity. Ribbentrop answered calmly. Accompanied by an interpreter and an officer, he climbed the 13 steps. Each step echoed loudly in the empty gym. The number of steps seemed a final mockery of fate. At the top, he was asked if he wished to speak. He hesitated briefly, then in a barely audible voice said, "God save Germany. I hope my country will reunite, that East and West will reconcile, and that peace will prevail in the world." A wish that would take many years to come true. Without further ceremony, his legs were secured with leather straps and his arms tightly bound. The executioner covered his face with a hood and adjusted the rope around his neck. At 1:14 a.m., the lever was activated, and Ribbentrop's body fell with a thud, leaving the rope swinging gently. Thus ended the life of the refined minister, reduced to a shadow in the annals of history. His body was cremated at the Dachau crematorium that same morning, and the ashes were scattered in the Isar, closing the chapter on one of the regime's key architects. At 1:20 a.m., knocks sounded again at the door. This time it was Wilhelm Keitel's turn. Like his predecessor, he was escorted to the gym to face his end at gallows number 2. Though his appearance was pale, he showed no sign of weakness as he walked with determined steps. Once at the top of the structure, he was allowed to speak his final words, delivered with firmness. "I invoke the Almighty to show mercy to the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers have perished before me. Now I follow my children. May God protect Germany." The procedure was carried out with precision. His face was covered with the hood, the rope placed around his neck, and the lever activated. The drop was swift, but his face struck the edge of the trapdoor violently, causing a profuse hemorrhage. At the same time, doctors hurried to gallows number 1, where they confirmed that Ribbentrop had already died. At 1:30 a.m., his death was officially certified. His body was removed from the rope, which was replaced to continue the executions. The corpse was transported behind the 3rd gallows, where the coffins for the condemned awaited. There it was placed with a tag on the chest for post-mortem photographs that would immortalize this dark chapter of history. At 1:40 a.m., Alfred Rosenberg entered the gym, walking steadily with his gaze fixed on the floor. His reserved demeanor contrasted sharply with that of the other condemned men. He was led to gallows number 2 without hesitation. When the clergyman approached, he firmly refused their assistance. He was the only one to reject spiritual consolation. When offered the chance to speak his final words, he responded with a curt "no," pressing his lips together as if there was nothing left to say. The executioner covered his face and placed the rope. When the lever was pulled, Rosenberg vanished into the void. Meanwhile, at gallows number 1, the doctors entered under the structure to confirm Ernst Kaltenbrunner's death, officially recorded at 1:52 a.m. As in previous cases, his body was placed in a labeled coffin alongside the others. The atmosphere in the gym grew increasingly dense and oppressive due to the number of executions and the emotional weight of the scene. To relieve the tension, attendants were allowed to smoke and drink while preparing for Hans Frank's turn, the next to ascend the gallows. The former governor of Poland entered accompanied by a Catholic priest, softly reciting prayers. His expression was serene, almost resigned. He advanced slowly, head bowed, with a reflective demeanor rather than one of fear. He approached gallows number 1, the same that had held Kaltenbrunner's body moments earlier. After following the standard protocol, he was offered a chance to speak his final words. In a calm voice, he said, "I appreciate all the care shown to me in prison. May God receive you under His guidance and holy protection." A devout message that seemed a late attempt at redemption. He then closed his eyes, moving his lips in silent prayer. Without delay, Woods placed the hood over his face, secured the rope, and activated the trap door. Frank fell, crossing the threshold between life and death. Meanwhile, at gallows number 2, doctors confirmed Alfred Rosenberg's death at 1:59 a.m. His body was transferred to the forensic area, leaving the site ready for the next execution. The night continued, heavy with a somber atmosphere. Wilhelm Frick was next to enter the gym, walking firmly toward gallows number 2, recently prepared after Rosenberg's removal. He responded decisively when identified, as if eager to hasten the end. However, his haste worked against him. He climbed the steps so quickly that he stumbled. The 2 military police had to steady him to prevent a fall that could have disrupted the procedure, as had happened with Göring, who had previously committed suicide. Regaining his balance and showing no signs of nervousness, he climbed the remaining steps swiftly. Once on the platform, his final words were brief. "Long live eternal Germany." The lever was then activated. His body fell violently and, as had happened to Keitel, struck his head, causing visible bleeding. Even in post-mortem photographs, his hands were bloodied, and a red streak ran down his back, forming a pool in the coffin where he was placed. While Frick hung lifeless, the doctors moved to gallows number 1 to certify Hans Frank's death. At 2:08 a.m., his death was confirmed, and his body was transferred to the medical area, leaving the gym ready for the next condemned. The night continued, heavy with tension and enveloped in a funeral-like silence. Sokol, like Streicher, chose to resist until the very end. He entered the gym wearing only trousers and a sweater, initially refusing to identify himself and offering fierce opposition. He climbed the steps with restrained anger. From the platform, he delivered a defiant speech. "I die innocent. This sentence is excessive. May God protect Germany and make it great again. May He watch over my family." At 2:26 a.m., the trapdoor opened. As in Streicher's case, a deep, shuddering cry erupted from his body as the rope tightened. But this time Woods did not intervene, likely considering that sound to be Sokol's final breath. Shortly after, gallows number 1 was cleared and prepared for the penultimate condemned, Alfred Jodl. Unlike many of his predecessors, Jodl presented himself with the dignity and composure of a soldier. He wore a pristine uniform with red rank stripes and polished boots under the dim lighting. He stated his name firmly, climbed the steps with determined steps, and upon reaching the top proclaimed, "Hail, my Germany." The trapdoor opened and he fell silently, his body hanging lifeless. Doctors certified Sokol's death at gallows number 2 at 2:40 a.m. The macabre session was nearing its end. At 2:45 a.m., Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the last condemned, entered. His fatigued appearance and slow gait revealed both physical and emotional exhaustion. He moved with difficulty, as if walking through a dream. He identified himself with a firm voice and began ascending the steps of gallows number 2. Each step was an effort. He paused as if the weight of age had suddenly fallen upon his shoulders, although he was only 54. On the platform his glasses were removed. He did not react, appearing almost in a trance. When offered a chance to speak, he seemed to awaken and declared, "I hope this execution is the last tragedy of the war, and that the lesson serves to achieve peace and understanding among nations. I believe in Germany." Although his statement came late, it was delivered with a composure that contrasted sharply with Streicher's fury. At 2:48 a.m. the trapdoor opened, and his body fell silently. The doctors, eager to conclude the night, certified his death at 2:59 a.m., not waiting the usual 15 minutes. Executioner John C. Woods proclaimed with satisfaction, 10 men in 103 minutes, That is efficiency, savoring the peculiar notoriety history would grant him for overseeing these executions. After removing Seyss-Inquart from the gallows and tagging his body, a team prepared the remains of Hermann Göring for transport to the gym. His suicide the previous night had caused unease among the Allies, who wished to dispel any suspicion of a possible plot. 12 minutes after the last execution, Allied delegates and members of the Provisional German government inspected Göring's body to confirm it was authentic and lifeless. Only army-authorized photographers captured images of the corpses, first clothed and then unclothed, before placing them in their coffins. Once this procedure was completed, the bodies were loaded onto 2 trucks and sent to Dachau, where a crematorium awaited. The ashes were to be scattered in the Isar River, preventing them from becoming symbols for regime loyalists. Reporters were confined in the gym for at least 2 hours, the time required to ensure the remains were completely removed. This measure aimed to prevent the bodies from becoming objects of veneration for stubborn Nazi sympathizers. Thus closed one of the darkest chapters in human history. Around 5:30 a.m., 2 trucks escorted by armored vehicles left Nuremberg prison, transporting the coffins of the high-ranking Nazis executed hours earlier. Their destination was the Fürth airfield, where a transport plane awaited to take them to Dachau. There, Richard Wagner, whose name carried a bitter historical irony, had prepared the crematorium furnace days in advance to reduce the condemned to ashes. Some reporters, eager for exclusive photographs, followed the convoy to capture images that could secure prominent headlines. Their attempt failed when an armored escort vehicle abruptly blocked their path. The turret was aimed at the journalists' cars, while an officer emerged from the hatch, indicating firmly but respectfully that they must return to Nuremberg. Without protest, the reporters turned back, resigned to report the events without the coveted photos. Upon arrival in Dachau, a careful count of the coffins was conducted before commencing the somber procedure. The first to be placed into the flames was Wilhelm Keitel's. The fire performed its final work, one by one, until the last coffin, Julius Streicher's, was reduced to ashes, closing the final chapter of those who once ruled the Third Reich. Once the remains were cremated, the furnace was turned off. The still hot embers were carefully collected and placed into 2 metal containers. Standard procedures were carried out, including signatures, records, and confidentiality clauses, binding all present to absolute silence regarding the events. This oath was upheld. The exact furnace where the cremation occurred and the precise location where the ashes were scattered were never revealed. Beyond the official report citing the Isar River as the final destination, no trace remained, a precaution to prevent the site from becoming a pilgrimage place for Nazi nostalgists in the future. As an epilogue to this dark story, it is worth noting the fate of the executed men's belongings. Those who once possessed everything ended up with only the essentials. On October 25th, just days after the executions, orders were issued to Colonel Andrus on how to handle the prisoners' personal effects. Medals and insignia bearing Nazi symbols were to be destroyed. Clothing and everyday items, along with cash up to 1,000 Reichsmarks, were to be returned to immediate family members. Anything remaining, including precious stones, was transferred to the financial department. The assets of prisoners sentenced to imprisonment, such as Göring, were frozen and moved to the Reichsbank under custody until their death or the completion of their sentence. The decorations, which today would be considered treasures by collectors, were divided into 2 categories. Simple items like common medals were destroyed without ceremony, even Göring's prestigious Pour le Mérite from the First World War. More luxurious decorations with valuable stones or metals were dismantled and the materials sold. The money raised was used to cover the high costs of the Nuremberg Trials, which totaled 4,435,719 Reichsmarks, a substantial sum at the time. Thus concluded not only the existence of the Third Reich's top leaders, but also the last physical traces of their power and grandeur, reduced to ashes and oblivion. Colonel Andrus was the one who delivered to Emmy Göring the belongings her husband had left behind after taking his own life. Despite the fortune Göring amassed during his life, what remained was only a shadow of his former grandeur. Several items had mysteriously disappeared or were given as gifts to guards by Göring himself, demonstrating his eccentricity to the very end. The list delivered to Emmy included 750 Reichsmarks in cash, a travel watch, a personal hygiene kit, a flask, a gold wallet, a pillbox, a wristwatch, a pocket watch with chain, a cigar cutter, a pen holder, 4 decorative buttons, 2 cufflinks, several gold and silver pins, one with a pearl, a small diamond-studded watch, a lighter, a divider compass, 2 eyeglass frames, 2 large suitcases, a hat box, and a flexible bag. Although still somewhat opulent, this collection was a pale reflection of the splendor that had once accompanied the Luftwaffe leader, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. However, not all relatives of the high-ranking Nazis accepted inheriting the material remnants of their infamy. Hedwig Kremar, widow of Alfred Rosenberg, along with her daughter Irene, chose not to receive any of the belongings linked to the Nazi ideologue. They not only refused the personal effects but also maintained complete silence about his past, avoiding interviews or any public mention of his figure. This stance appears to reflect a firm desire to sever all connections to one of the brains behind Nazi doctrine. While Göring continued to attract attention even after his death, the Rosenbergs decided to fade from the historical spotlight, allowing Alfred's crimes to speak for themselves without a familial filter. In this way, the end of these leaders not only marked the collapse of their authority, but also the severing of the material and human ties they had woven throughout their lives. John C. Woods, the executioner of Nuremberg. Emerging from the shadows of this episode was a man previously unfamiliar with such a role. John Woods, an American non-commissioned officer, would be responsible for carrying out the death sentences. His contempt for the Germans and lack of experience would give the executions a controversial and grim character. Preparations began with an order to the firm John Eden and Company in London, renowned for producing sails and nautical ropes, though they also discreetly manufactured hanging ropes for British prisons. For this commission, Harry MX, one of their workers, crafted 40 Italian hemp ropes, each 3.10 meters long, chosen for their low elasticity to ensure a sharp drop that would break the neck immediately, avoiding a slow suffocation. Unlike the British tradition, which included a lambskin padding in the noose and a bronze ring closure to reduce external damage, the ropes sent to Nuremberg were more rudimentary. A traditional American knot was used with 7 to 9 turns and no padding. In the UK, ropes were carefully adjusted to the condemned's weight and height to ensure precision. However, the Americans used a standard drop between 1.20 and 1.80 meters, determined only by height, which sparked speculation about Woods's brutality. Although no conclusive evidence was found, rumors circulated that the executioner may have deliberately adjusted the executions to increase suffering. The gymnasium designated for the executions was strictly secured under orders from Colonel Andrus. Only authorized personnel were allowed inside, including the executioner and his assistants. After the gallows were installed, 90-kilogram sandbags were used to test the trapdoors. Everything was prepared under an atmosphere of tense anticipation for the condemned men's final moments. John Woods was born on June 5, 1911 in Wichita, Kansas. His childhood was marked by his father abandoning him at the age of 2, after which he was raised by his grandmother. He dropped out of high school after 2 years and enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1929, only to desert a few months later and be dishonorably discharged, diagnosed with psychopathic inferiority without signs of psychosis. He later worked in construction and farming during the Great Depression, with brief employment in the Civilian Conservation Corps, from which he was also dismissed. Despite his failures, he managed to marry a nurse, Hazel Chilcott, although they had no children. When World War II broke out in 1941, Woods was able to join the Army because no one reviewed his prior record. In 1943, he was assigned to an engineering battalion, performing support duties. A year later, as the Allies prepared for D-Day, the Army faced a shortage of executioners to carry out death sentences for dozens of U.S. soldiers convicted of crimes such as murder, desertion, or rape. Woods volunteered, claiming he had participated in executions in Texas and Oklahoma, a false statement, as capital punishment in those states had been carried out by electrocution for years. Despite lacking documentation, he was accepted, received a pay increase, and began executing sentences. Between 1944 and 1945, he carried out 34 executions of American soldiers in France and assisted in at least 3 others. He was also involved in 11 botched executions, revealing his lack of skill. Woods soon gained notoriety for his unkempt appearance and unprofessional behavior. His peers described him as a walking disaster. He dressed sloppily, wore a grown-out beard, dirty shoes, wrinkled and stained clothing, and a misshapen cap. Even his rank insignia were sewn incorrectly, with visible yellow thread. His breath was foul, his teeth yellow, and his neck grimy, completing the image of a man who entirely neglected his presentation. Despite this, his presence did not bother Colonel Barton C. Andrus, with whom he shared a strong hatred for Germans. When entrusted with the execution of the main Nazi criminals, Woods faced several obstacles. He did not know the exact weight and height of the condemned, essential for calculating the proper rope length. He improvised on the spot, which had fatal consequences. Star journalists reported that Woods may have adjusted the ropes to prolong the agony. Julius Streicher, for example, received a poorly placed noose allegedly on purpose. The same occurred with Alfred Jodl, whose death lasted 24 minutes. These errors sparked enormous controversy, forever marking the memory of those executions as something more than mere justice, seen by some as a mix of clumsiness and possibly revenge. Although the U.S. Army denied irregularities, post-execution photographs clearly showed the battered faces of the condemned, triggering an intense debate over Woods's methods. Some argued that his disregard for technical standards and hatred of Germans influenced the outcomes. Despite the criticism, Woods expressed pride in his work. In later statements, he said, "I hanged those 10 Nazis and I'm proud of it. I wasn't nervous. A man can't afford to be nervous in this line of work." However, fate reserved a bitterly ironic final act. On July 21, 1950, while working at a military base in the Marshall Islands repairing a lighting system, he suffered a fatal electric shock. Some suggested sabotage, possibly by resentful German scientists. However, the Army officially declared it an accident. The end of the Black Order. The executions of SS leaders during the Nuremberg Trials marked a turning point in history. Some cases, however, were processed separately, such as that of Oswald Pohl, head of the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office. Born on June 30, 1892, into a well-off family and educated in Latin and Greek, he initially wanted to study science but chose the Navy during World War I. After the conflict, he joined the Freikorps and in 1925 entered the SA, and in 1929 the SS. In 1933, Himmler, impressed by his administrative skills, assigned him to reorganize the SS finances. Under his management, concentration camps were transformed into extermination centers. He introduced forced labor, financed the expansion of Auschwitz and Majdanek, and calculated that a 9-month-old prisoner generated 1,630 Reichsmarks. He also oversaw the looting of assets ranging from jewelry to gold bars, reinvesting these profits. Captured in 1946, Pohl was tried alongside 17 other officers in the Pohl trial for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and membership in a criminal organization. Although he tried to defend himself as a mere administrator, the evidence condemned him. His sentence was death. In the early hours of June 7, 1951, he was taken to the gallows at Landsberg. A priest accompanied him until he was restrained. A hood and rope were placed, and after a brief silence, the lever was pulled. He fell into the void, ending his life. Karl Hermann Frank was another post-war execution. Promoted to SS Gruppenführer, He controlled the police apparatus and Gestapo in Czechoslovakia. After the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in May 1942, he led reprisals in the Lidice massacre, where men were executed, women deported, and children killed. A total of 340 people were murdered, and the village was erased from the map. Weeks later, similar repression occurred in Lizaki, men executed and children sent to camps. Frank initially tried to surrender to the Americans but was extradited to Prague. Trial after trial, he argued that his actions could be considered homicide under human standards. Yet the Prague People's Court sentenced him to death on May 21, 1946, for his role in Lidice and Lizaki. Prosecutor Jaroslav Derb recalled, "I watched helplessly as Hitler destroyed my nation. Suddenly, I had the power to judge those who caused so much pain." Frank, who had never shown compassion, petitioned President Edvard Benz for clemency, but his appeal was ignored. On May 22, 1946, he was executed publicly. Over 5,000 people witnessed his death. He was brought to the gallows supported by a sling. He fell less than a meter, and as the executioner covered his face, he declared, "Germany must live even if we die. Long live the German nation. Long live the German spirit." His body remained suspended for 45 minutes before being buried in an anonymous grave alongside J. Kubis and Joseph G., the assassins of Heydrich. His family found no solace. His wife Carola was arrested and deported to Kazakhstan, where she spent 10 years in a gulag. She was released in 1955 and reunited with her 3 children 4 years later, who had been raised under false identities. Oskar Dirlewanger was another SS leader captured in June 1945 by French troops north of Mauthausen. He died days later under unclear circumstances. Some claimed he was beaten by resentful subordinates. Others suggested torture by Polish guards working for the French. The official certificate stated natural death, but rumors persisted. It was said that he survived and later worked for the Egyptian army in the 1950s. When his body was exhumed, it was identified by his dog tag. Though with networks like Odessa in existence, the discovery raised doubts. However, responsibility did not rest solely on Dirlewanger. He was part of a system that gave power to agents without ethical limits. Operating unchecked, he led a group composed of marginalized criminals, a sick man who, armed with authority, became an instrument of horror. History shows that had the Nazi regime triumphed, his figure might have been emblematic, perhaps even honored with streets or monuments. Instead, his life ended ambiguously. His legacy of brutality, however, persists as a warning. This was not an isolated case, but part of a machine designed to exploit evil without restraint. Rudolf Höss from Auschwitz to the gallows. Rudolf Höss, former commandant of Auschwitz, attempted to hide in Flensburg under the alias Franz Lang, disguised as a Kriegsmarine officer. He was initially captured and released by British troops, as his disguise aroused little suspicion. Later, during interrogations of Bergen-Belsen survivors, information about his role in Auschwitz emerged, prompting British intelligence to act. They located his family and subjected his wife Hedwig to questioning, threatening deportation to Siberia to force the revelation of his hiding place. On March 11, 1946, he was arrested on a farm near Flensburg by British soldiers led by Hans Alexander, a German Jewish officer. Höss was beaten, taken into custody, and subjected to 3 days of torture and sleep deprivation. He signed a statement admitting responsibility for the murder of millions. He was called to testify as a defense witness at Nuremberg on April 15, 1946. He admitted executing Himmler's direct orders to carry out the final solution, and explained that Auschwitz was chosen for its strategic location. He initially estimated 2.5 million deaths, later revising the figure to 1.1 million. This discrepancy caused controversy. His testimony emphasized that he saw his role as an obligation, showing no remorse. In May, he was extradited to Poland. He faced trial in April 1947 and was sentenced to death for his direct responsibility in the massacres. Former prisoners requested that he be executed in the very camp he had commanded. Their request was granted. On April 16, 1947, he was taken to Block 11 of Auschwitz, known as the Death Block. He asked for a cup of coffee and walked calmly to the gallows, where a clergyman offered spiritual comfort. At 6 a.m., after the reading of his sentence, he was hanged at the site where thousands had died under his orders. His body remained suspended while a doctor certified his death. It was then cremated, and the ashes dispersed in an unknown location to prevent the site from becoming a Nazi shrine.